Now, sometimes when you're dealing with alternate histories, they can be rather easy. It's a very straightforward switch to make them happen. And sometimes it's very difficult. It is very, very difficult. And today's one is much more of a difficult alternate history than you might think. And I'm going to be explaining why. And I think it's sometimes important to do this with alternate histories, because the point is, and the way I always do the alternate history is where I give you the history up until the Shameless book plug, and then the alternate history after the Shameless book plug, is that I try and explain what the history was and why that happened the way it did. And then the reason I like to do alternate histories is to ask a question of, why didn't this happen? What would have to happen for this to happen? And one of the questions that often comes up about the Battle of Samar, about Leyte Gulf, is why does Ching not do this? And very quickly, once we get into this video, you're going to find out it comes down to destroyers. Realistically, he doesn't really have the option because of destroyers. He doesn't have the option. But still, it's worthwhile considering. You see, this is a battle which is full of leadership decisions, and full of them, full of thoughts. Not least because it's a battle where Halsey in some ways gets actually outsmarted by Toyoda Sumi. And when I say outsmarted, I mean he gets outplayed. He gets outplayed because the Japanese do something which he wouldn't do. At this point, the Americans weren't sending surface action groups anywhere. They really weren't depending on surface action groups. They're all mated into their forces, they're all core components of their forces, but realistically, the surface action group was not something which the Americans were considering as an offensive tool. They're considering it as an amphibious warfare tool, a support tool, but not really an offensive tool. And yet the Japanese still were. In many ways, the Japanese were still considering that as a viable method of war. And considering how close they actually come, thanks to the misunderstandings that took place in terms of what was going on, what the Japanese were doing, how many forces you were facing on the Japanese, yeah, that works for them. It works for them. But realistically, the Battle of Leyte Gulf is a massive operation. It is one of the largest battles that took place of all time. In fact, there is honestly an argument about maybe not calling it one battle, because whilst it is one operation, it's a lot of disparate battles. They're not really joined up. But there again, that is the nature of naval forces. That is the nature of naval warfare. It's often both joined and disjointed at the same time. It's the fun thing when you start talking to people about it and they're going, well, how's this system going to deal with this weapon system? It's going to be annihilated. And you go, yes, well, you see, that system is operating with that system and that system and that system, and that system might try and annihilate this, but it's got to go through all those systems and everything else. So that's the answer to your question. It's the same as operation. On paper, the Americans have overwhelming dominance and advantage. They really do. That doesn't mean the Japanese have to agree with it, though. The thing is, your opponent always gets a vote, and just because on paper you completely outmass them, doesn't mean they have to agree with it. They can still think they can throw some dice. And this whole battle plan, this whole operation was Kaigen Taisho Toyoda Somu's roll of the dice. It really was. And still, I would say, for all the decisions that go wrong with Halsey, it wasn't... He didn't have the worst day at the office he'd ever had. He got more right than he got wrong. It's very easy to remember the mistakes. When you make mistakes, people die in war. So the mistakes are very easy to hang on you. Halsey's not one of my favourite admirals from World War II. I won't pretend otherwise. But he's certainly not one of the worst ones. He does good work when he's given the chance. And he's aggressive when you need aggressive. there are a few who take that aggression a little bit further, but yeah, some of them are luckier. With that being said, let's start off by doing, well, day by days of the battle. On the morning of 24th October, we find ourselves in an interesting situation for the US Navy of, well, reality has happened. They have 3 carrier task groups, task forces, task groups, part of the 3rd Fleet, sitting there available. Task Force 38.2, 38.3, and 38.4. They are commanded by, in the case of 38.2, Bogan, in the case of 38.3, Sherman, and the case of 38.4, Davidson. Now, the interesting thing is, of course, Mitcher, Vice Admiral Mark Mitcher, who's in charge of Task Force 38, he's aboard Lexington, which is in Task Group 38.3. So he's sitting there in Task Group 38.3, which is under the command, technically, of Rear Admiral Sherman. But also, Admiral William F. Halsey is aboard the USS New Jersey, the battleship, and she's sitting in Task Force 38.2. So in effect, whilst in theory those task groups are completely independent command of Rear Admirals, in reality the only Rear Admiral who you think would be fine and on his own and actually in charge of his own task group would be Rear Admiral Ralph Davidson. Apart from sitting in the middle of his task group is USS Washington, with a certain gentleman called Vice Admiral Willis Lee aboard. Which means, yes, every one of the task groups that is technically under the command of a Rear Admiral has a Vice Admiral or a full Admiral sitting in it. This is one of those interesting points of history to think about on 24th October 1944. The US Navy likes to pride itself, and people like to talk about, oh, these task groups are being led by Rear Admirals. They are. But they seem to always have a Vice Admiral or a full Admiral who's maybe their technical superior, maybe their technical superior's superior. Or in the case of Vice Admiral Lee, okay, he's in charge of the battleships in the forces, and technically not in charge of me, but he's also got his flagship USS Washington, which has 9 16-inch guns, well within range of my carrier if I start to be annoying for him. Just saying, I'm sure he wouldn't. Sure he wouldn't. But, you know, he's there. So, this is the situation you have. And this is not the full Task Force, this is not the full Task Force 38. This is not the full 3rd Fleet. Because there are all sorts of ships not there. On 22nd of October, 2 of the task groups had been, 2 carrier task groups had been sent back to Leyte to rearm. So that's 40% of the strength gone. There's also the fact that when we start to look at the actual organisational force, pardon me, the strongest force, task group 38.4, which has Franklin, Enterprise, San Jacinto, and Belleau Wood, i.e. 2 fleet carriers and 2 light carriers sitting in it, as well as USS Washington, USS Alabama, so a Washington class, a North Carolina class, and a South Dakota class sitting there going hello, and 2 heavy cruisers and a whole load of destroyers sitting there. That task group, that is Task Group 38.4, technically under Davison, technically under Rear Admiral Ralph Davison, technically. Just a lot of very senior people peering over his shoulder, heavily armed senior people. That's not necessarily in the best position to engage things which are being put through. Not necessarily. And this causes issues. You have land-based aircraft attacks, you have all sorts of things going on all day, and this is one of the problems they are dealing with is that there is these constant operations, and ships wear out, and ships run out of ammunition, and ships run out of supplies, and so what you have is a paper strength versus the real strength. And even as the 24th goes on, they lose to Princeton, a light carrier, to an attack, and as she's going well, she causes enough damage around her that there's also Birmingham is put out of action, has to be sent home, and other vessels are damaged. And this is a constant throughout the day. The Americans are suffering a constant attrition. They're winning, but they're suffering constant attrition. And that means that when Kurita turns his fleet around, and Kurita is in charge of the Center Force, we're talking more about them later, but when he turns them around, Halsey assumes that this is a retreat, that the Japanese are going away. But of course, once they turn around once, they can turn around again. And that then leads to the San Bernardino Strait, where there had been plans. There had been plans for a force to be sent to the San Bernardino Strait to block it. This had been a surface force, and we'll be talking about this in a second in more detail, but a message had been sent out at 12:15 on the 24th of October, which was taken by many who receive it to suggest that Halsey was going to send a surface force to cover the San Bernardino Strait. The fact is, he didn't. Basically, he was sending a message which was, well, if I think there's a threat, this is what I'm going to do. And it was ambiguously worded enough that you could take it as, this is what I'm doing, or he could claim, well, no, I never said I was actually doing it. I said this, I was going to do it. I could do it. Because, it has to be. These ships will be formed as Task Force 34 under Vice Admiral Lee, Commander Battle Line. Task Force 34 to engage decisively at long ranges, whilst Carrier Task Group 38.4, 38.2, and 38.2 are to provide air support. Pretty much. It was apparently his contingency plan. But he sends in copies of this contingency plan to Nimitz, to King in Washington, not to Admiral Kincaid and the 7th Fleet, although Kincaid does manage to receive it by various means, and instead well, they interpreted it as happening. After all, he'd meant will be formed as in future tense. But he, of course, didn't give any definition in that report, in that message, as to what were the contingencies which required their formation. Will be formed. Will be formed. And so most people took it as, you're forming this up, not, we will form this up under contingencies which I haven't yet specified. Later on, he clarifies it as if the enemy sorties through San Bernardino Strait and San Bernardino Strait, and that was he clarifies this a couple of hours later. Task Force 34 will be formed when directed by me. So the enemy could sortie through the strait, and if he doesn't direct it, it won't be formed. So basically, he has sent out a paper tiger. And the second message was sent by voice radio, so it wasn't intercepted by 7th Fleet. And it wasn't followed up by repeated messages to Nimitz or King. Or, of course, to Kincaid of 7th Fleet. So, he had sent everyone his first message about "will be informed," and then he sent another message which clarified it, which doesn't get near enough circulation, but it does cover them. I'm sorry, but this is the point at which I do start to question Halsey's judgment here. But, he's had a pretty successful day, and so pretty much he is sending this through as boilerplate. I think, honestly, he thinks he's beaten the Japanese back. They're not coming again. So why does he need to worry about this? There's just people worrying, so I'm just going to send him something to fob them off. He'll fob them off. This is what I might do. There's a really interesting point here, because technically, some of the ships he assigns to this hostile, again, this includes his own flagship. So here's the question. Will he be going with Lee? In which case, 2 task groups will lose their senior officer in it, their vice admiral, who's in there to act as reassurance / backup to the rear admiral. Or will he transfer flag? In which case, that'll take some time, transferring his flag to a different ship. At 1640 hours, they finally locate Oswa's Northern Force. And yes, you could say that they'd been justifiably distracted by the Centre Force, but, they missed quite a lot of what the Japanese are doing around there. And once they find the Oswa's force, they find this carrier group, which is a wonderful thing. It's carriers. This must be the primary threat. Well, they head to intercept it. He's taking all 3 groups to attack the Northern Force. All 3 groups to attack the Northern Force. Which are carrying 108 aircraft across Zukaku, Zuho, Chitose, and Chiyoda. Which, by the way, are all sunk on the 25th and 26th of October. In the Battle of Copenhagen. But the point is here, yeah, they've got carriers, but you're taking all your force and you don't leave behind a covering force to cover San Bernardino Strait in case the Centre Force comes back? And this gets worse as the night goes on. Because as they are proceeding north, as they are trying to track them down, there's not even leaving a destroyer picket in the San Bernardino Strait, and they're ignoring information coming through. Now, when Bogan, who's, I mentioned, the Rear Admiral in charge of Task Force 38.2, radios in with information that scout aircraft from Independence had spotted the Creeder's flagship force had turned back, the Centre Force had turned back, he's rebuffed. And a staff officer replies, yes, we have that information. Admiral Lee sends a blinker message, because he managed to catch up with him, to Halsey's flagship, saying, I think we're being bluffed, basically. And is very similarly rebuffed. Commodore Arleigh Burke and James H. Flatley, the commander, both of them on Mitch's staff, independently, come to a similar conclusion. There are lots of people sitting there going, hang on, there's a tiny carrier force which is really not that powerful. We are chasing at it with everything we've got, leaving a massive surface action group behind us. And that is what leads us into the 25th of October, because That is when we get the Battle of Surigao Strait and the Battle of Samar. And both these battles have bearing. Well, the Battle of Surigao Strait is an ambush, and it's a telling thing of what could have happened. What could have happened at Samar, or more importantly in the San Bernardino Strait, if there had been forces properly deployed. Because you see, Kinkaid had heard things were coming. So he sent Jesse Oldnorth with the 6 older battleships, the West Virginia, the Maryland, the Mississippi, the Tennessee, the California, and Pennsylvania, which carried about, how do I put this, 48 14-inch guns and 16 16-inch guns between them. Enough to cause some real fun. Some heavy cruisers, including Oldendorf's flagship, and some light cruisers, and 28 destroyers and 39 motor torpedo boats. Five of the ships involved, 5 of the 6 ships involved, those battleships, they had been damaged or sunk at Pearl Harbor. In the case of California and West Virginia, had been rebuilt completely. Mississippi had been the exception. She was in Iceland on convoy escort duty in the we're totally not a war against Nazi Germany phase of the Battle Atlantic, where the Americans keep pushing the neutrality zone further and further east across the Atlantic. At a certain point, they'd have been pushing it all the way to the coast of the UK, I swear. But we'll leave that to one side. What happens? What happens is the Japanese lose ships, but they come up, they get attacked by torpedo boats, and then they go into a wall of fire. They literally come up, and it's the Battle of Tsushima all over again. But this time the Americans are the Japanese, and the Japanese are the Russians. They are running straight into a wall of fire, a wall of light cruisers, heavy cruisers, and battleships, firing non-stop. Just blasting away. And the results? Well, this is considered the last battleship battle of World War II. And of the forces, well, the Southern Force is technically under Nishimura, but he takes direct command of Force C, and then Nishima in charge of the second striking force that's sort of supporting him. Of Nishimura's force, which is made up of the Fuso, Yamashiro, Magami, the Mishio, the Yamagumo, and the Yasumo, and the Shigure, only the Shigure survives. Only the Shigure survives. She sunk later on in January, I think, the following year by USS Blackfish, if I'm not mistaken, the American submarine. And the second striking force, well, they get sunk by air attacks and mostly manage to pull out, and they get lost later on in the war. You have Nashi, Ashigara, Abukuma is sunk on the 26th of October, so the day after, and Akebono, Anushio, and Kasumi both all get away. Shiruni, well, she is sunk by air attack on the 27th of October. For the Allied forces in the battle, for the Allied forces, there are no losses, but there is a Trouble-class destroyer sitting there adding to the fight. I just wanted to add that in. You know, HMAS Arunta is there and is happily popping away, as is HMAS Shropshire, a county-class cruiser of the Australian Navy at that point. Formerly Royal Navy, but she'd been given to the Australian Navy to replace a vessel they'd lost earlier in the war. Their only real damage done to them is Albert W. Grant, a Fletcher-class destroyer, which is damaged by both friendly and enemy gunfire. It gets into the way. It's an old-school fight worthy of Oldendorf. It really is. It is a brawling fight, but he has literally positioned his force in the perfect position for them. And this means, again, the Americans are feeling pretty darn confident. They're feeling pretty darn confident coming off that one. But at the same time as that's taking place, at the same time as that is going on, the Northern force is doing what it needs to do. It's been located, it's sacrificing itself. And realistically, more importantly, the Americans have been caught. The San Bernardino Strait has been forged. The southern group and the northern group are both distractions. The center group is the main force. And they have pushed in, and this is where we get the Battle of Samar. And the Battle of Samar is a tale of heroism by US Navy destroyers. Heroism without really modern parallel, but at the time, amongst destroyer forces, there are a fair number of destroyer battles where they are similarly like it. For some reason, we think it must be small boats like PT boats, which behave insane when they're faced with the enemy. No, destroyer crews were trained for pretty much 20 years from the end of World War I, with the idea that it was their job to charge the enemy. Their job to get close and kill them. Their job to hold the enemy off, to do whatever was necessary. And in World War II, you get to see, I would argue, 4 navies, four major navies and a couple of small navies exhibit this to the greatest degree. You've got the Polish and the Dutch navies. Their ships are without... They're just brave. They are just brave beyond brave. You've got the Regia Marina. Their destroyer crews, equally brave and efficient. You've got the Japanese destroyer crews. Honestly, you don't want to get in a fight with them. Whatever they're lacking in other systems, they are not lacking in bravery. And the Royal Navy and US Navy are just the same. You know, we can trade off. I realize there are people who try and do this sometimes, who sell these pointless who was braver at the battle, the Battle of Samar, or when the single destroyer charges the German cruiser, HMS Glowworm. And the question is, why are you trying to draw lines between these people who are so brave? Why are you trying to rank them? It seems almost desecratory, really. The thing is, they were brave and they did their duty because that was what they knew they needed to do. That was the image they held themselves to. And they did a really, really good job. Because every time they did it, they achieved something. And that matters. Now, in this scenario, Samar should have been the Battle of San Bernardino Strait. There should have been a task force there. Quite a lot of senior command believed there was going to be a task force there, but as we're getting into etc., there's a lot of clarification in the wording, which means there isn't going to be something there. And so the Japanese have got through the San Bernardino Strait, and once they're through that, they fall upon 7th Fleet's organizational force. I would say its support force. They fall upon its task groups, which are there to support the Central Philippines operations. They're escort carriers being used in the strike carrier role. They don't have enough destroyers around them. They don't have enough escorts. They don't have any battleships, any cruisers. They have nothing with them apart from escort carriers and destroyers. And not even all of those managed to get involved. Most of them are John C. Butler class destroyer escorts. Some are Fletcher class destroyers. But they only have 9 Fletchers across the entirety of the Task Force 77. Only 9 of them are sitting in Task Force 77. The rest are all John C. Butlers, and they're good ships. They are good ships. But there are only 13 of those. So a total force we're talking about is 22 destroyers. And they're divided across 3 different task groups. So there really aren't a lot of destroyers to go around. No task group has more than 3 Fletchers in it. So in terms of what we would consider real warships, and I always differentiate between what I would call warships, escorts, and support assets. Okay? Once we're talking full fleet destroyers, they are warships. Anything below that is an escort. It's a presence asset. It's a supporter. It's an asset which is there to assist other things in a warfighting role. Or it's got one purpose. It's ASW warfare orientated or a convoy escort or those things. It is not supposed to be fighting other warships of greater or equivalent or greater status. A destroyer can engage another destroyer quite happily. An escort destroyer will probably fight another destroyer. But it's not there to fight cruisers. A fleet destroyer goes, well, this is why they pay me the big bucks and why I have the big torpedoes. Show me to your cruiser. That's the point. So realistically, there to protect them, protect this whole force, there are 9 destroyers, 9 Fletchers. And they come bumbling into Task Unit 77 4.3, aka Taffy 3. Under the command of Rear Admiral Clifton A.F. Sprague. And he has, well, 6 escort carriers. He loses 2 this day. One of them sunk by gunfire, one sunk by a kamikaze. He has the Hull, the Heermann, and the Johnston as his 3 Fletchers. He has the Dennis, the John C. Butler, the Raymond, and the Samuel B. Roberts as his 4 Butlers. He will lose Gambier Bay, Hull, Johnston, and Samuel B. Roberts to gunfire. And his destroyers will chuck themselves into battle versus a Japanese force which is built around Yamato, Nagato, Kongo, and Haruna. The Japanese are forced back. The Japanese do not push on as far as they could have pushed on, because there really isn't anything there to stop them. There really isn't anything there to stop them. But they get pushed back. The air attacks coming in from all the escort aircraft, etc., all the things mount up and it forces them to withdraw. One of the problems is that his own force, Kurita, the admiral in charge for the Japanese, when Yamato has to turn north to evade torpedoes, well, she loses contact with battle, and so he needs to reorganize his force. And while he's reorganizing his force, the Americans are bringing in more forces. And they have a lack of air reconnaissance. And, well, he believes there is more there. There is more coming than he knows. That's his belief. That there is more coming. More must be coming. There is only way they can be fighting is if more is coming. And he's lost cruisers. He's lost ships to air attack during this battle. Suzuya, Chikuma, and Shokai, really. And he'll lose more to air attack over the following days. But the point is, it's a hard battle, but it could have been a lot different. You see, if we can compare Samar to Surigao Strait, what's the difference if the Americans are prepared for them coming versus not prepared for them coming? And that's realistically the idea of where Admiral Lee being there comes in. It's, what happens if he's there to prepare their forces? What happens if he's there to make things ready? And so let's consider the formation of Task Force 34 and what exactly was said. And this is the key point you have to consider when talking about Halsey's, to an extent, culpability for what happened. Because he does share culpability. He is the one who's, in the nicest way, the buck stops somewhere and he's the one who managed to get outfought, as in THOUGHT, by his counterpart. That's it. He gets outfought. Not outfought, FOUGHT. He gets outfought, THOUGHT. Battle Division 7, Biloxi, Vincennes, Miami, Desron 52, Les Stephen Porter, from Task Group 38.2, and Washington, Alabama, Wichita, New Orleans, and Destroyer Division 100, Patterson and Bagley, from TG 38.4, will be formed as Task Force 34 under Vice Admiral Lee, Commander Battle Line. Task Force 34 to engage decisively at long ranges. Carrier Task Group 38.4 conduct carriers of Task Groups 38.2 and Task Groups 38.4 clear of surface fighting. Instructions for Task Group 38.3 and Task Groups 38.1 later. Halsey, Officer OTC in New Jersey. Now let's consider will be formed. Will be formed. Will be formed. You can understand why some people thought that this meant he was forming this force up. Some people looked at it and went, yeah, that means he must be forming this force up. He must be. And of course, he wasn't. He sends back a further clarification message later, saying that he is sent by a different methodology, saying it'll be formed upon my discretion. So this is why there's not even a destroyer picket at the San Bernardino Strait. There is no warning. There is no one sitting looking in that direction going, Because 7th Fleet, Nimitz, and King, everyone is looking down, and everyone is around him, presumes there's something already there. That there is something watching for this gap. And this is one of the interesting things and the real lesson for war. Okay? People like to make fun of Admiral Beatty and how he managed to blame non-communications officers for the messages he sends, which are confusing. 20 years later, we're talking about someone who did the same thing. Communications matter in war. Clarity of communication so people understand what you're doing, when you're doing, and how you're doing it matter in war. This is one of the reasons why the amount of data which goes through modern forces has grown so exponentially. So commanders can know where their stuff is. Because, let's remember that old line. Know yourself and you will never be defeated. Know your enemy and you will always have a chance of victory. Know both yourself and your enemy and you will rule. I know, someone has corrupted Sun Tzu, but it's a good saying. It's a good one, which has been passed down for a number of years for historians, and it's quite true. You might not win if you know yourself, but you won't lose either. If you know yourself and your own limitations, you'll make sure you're in a battle where the worst you're going to come out from is a draw, a stalemate. You might win, but you won't lose, because you know yourself. You know your own limitations. You know your own capabilities. You won't do anything which isn't going to cost you too much or exceed your abilities. Know your enemy. Well, then you can start taking them apart. You can win battles because you know where they will be, so you can know how to do them. Know yourself and your enemy, so you know where they're weak, and you know your abilities, so you can make use of your abilities in the best way to counteract their abilities and play to their weaknesses. You'll rule. You'll rule the battlefield. This scenario, this whole operation, this whole thing is the scenario where they don't know what themselves. You know, one of the interesting things was, look at the sheer amount of forces sent, the sheer amount of forces that are dispatched to the Battle of Surrey Strait. Think about just how much Kinkaid organises to be there. Look at the force he's facing. Does he need all that force there? Probably not. Probably not. We are talking dozens of destroyers and torpedo boats. Dozens of cruisers, a picket force, all sorts of things. If Kinkaid hadn't believed the San Bernardino Strait was covered by someone else, the odds are he deploys at least something to go watch it. Kinkaid is many things. Many, many things. I have many issues with Kinkaid. But he's paranoid enough. He wouldn't have left it unguarded if he didn't believe someone else was guarding it. And that changes the scenario you have immediately. If someone's there when the Japanese are starting to come through, they're going to send a noise off about it. They're going to start messaging people. Radio out, we've got enemy service group here, and you can start organising your forces and deal with it appropriately. Your ships aren't going to be caught napping. You're going to be able to form something up. What does he actually have there? Well, let's consider the forces he deploys. There is at least Task Force 77.3, which is made up of HMS Shropshire, 2 Brooklyn class light cruisers, and Desron 24, which includes 5 Fletchers and a Tribal. That would be the perfect force, really, to deploy up there as a picket force to watch it. But he already has a picket patrol force, which he has down in the Battle of Surrey Strait, which is made up of Destroyer Division 107, Destroyer Division 108, aka Destroyer Squadron 54. 5 Fletcher class destroyers. You know, it's not an unlikely thing to think that he might take some of the destroyers from Task Force Unit 77.2, which has 9 Fletchers, and go send some of them up there. He'd have done something. Would that have changed the battle? Yes, it would have changed the Battle of Samar. I think it made it less likely the Americans suffer the losses they do. But that is not what happened. This message is sent, and many personnel take it as meaning that strait was covered, and that opens up a gap which the Japanese come pouring through. Because the Japanese are not enemies at any point that you give an opening to. They are better than that. They deserve more respect than that. With that being said, Shameless Book Plug time. So, Shameless Book Plug. Well, thank you for watching this video. Hope you're enjoying it. Yeah, this was a interesting one to do, because as I'll be talking about throughout this alternate history, throughout the whole time, there are problems with actually implementing this as an alternate history. The problems start off with that lovely instruction of the Force to be doing, because the Force is supposed to be drawn not from one task group. It's a task group which is going to be made up of multiple ships drawn from multiple other different task groups. And that's a problem. And it's supposed to include ships which include Iowas, which would be very nice to have. They'd be really useful to have for a fight like this. But the thing is, those Iowas come with Halsey, and there's no way that I think Lee can hijack Halsey's own flagship and take it off with him. I just don't see it going down that way. There are grounds, considering Lee's own work, that if he had this communication, he can probably make it work to get some ships moving. But you have to remember, what he would be doing would be a tremendous risk to his career. If the enemy turned up and he fought a battle, he'd be a victor, and Halsey would soon be saying, well, you did exactly as I told you to, sorry my ships couldn't arrive, that sort of thing. Possibly he'd be declaring vengeance and be trying to attack him, but either way, a glorious battle does tend to make it rather difficult to take someone out politically in the Navy. I know, I come from the UK. We had a guy called Admiral Nelson a little while back who, well, let's put it this way, he had a habit of being quite bad at politics. And even in World War II, we had a guy called Philip Vian who abandoned a convoy, had a ship sunk underneath him, but kept winning battles. So the important thing was he kept winning battles. So he got away with all sorts of sins. But yeah, shameless book plug. Thank you for watching the channel. Thank you for liking, sharing, subscribing, helping the channel grow. Thank you for buying my book. More are coming out soon. I know I keep saying that, but more are coming out soon. I just need 5 minutes to actually get them all happy, make myself all happy with them. Now here's the fun thing, because if Lee does get this order and decides to start taking stuff with him ahead to the San Bernardino Strait, he takes it as, this is my order to go and do this. And therefore presumes certain things are going to join up with him when he gets there. What can he take with him? What can he ensure he's taking with him? Well, Battleship Division 8 and 9, unfortunately, are currently divided. They are divided. Washington is with Lee, as is Alabama, and they are in Task Force 38.4. But Massachusetts and South Dakota are in Task Force 38.3. Helpful. He's got New Orleans and Wichita with him, so he's got 2 heavy cruisers. And he's got Destroyer Squadron 6, which are some Bagley class, which are okay. They're gonna do. Ralph Talbot was supposed to be retained by Task Force 38.4, but he could take 3 Bagley class with him. So, under his direct command, he's got 2 battleships, 2 heavy cruisers, and 3 destroyers. Now, the thing is, Halsey's hanging out with Task Force 38.2, and he's unlikely to get any of the forces from there. He can't flag that in any way, because Halsey's there and Halsey's staff are there. So that means Iowa and New Jersey, Battleship Division 7 are completely lost to him. He's not getting them. Cruiser Division 14, i.e. Vincennes, Miami and Biloxi. Nope. He won't be getting those either. And there's Ron 52. Nope. There is an interesting discussion as to where particular Destroyer Division 104 and the Destroyer Squadron 50 are, but I destroyed Division 100. I mean, well, Destroyer Squadron 50, but it's Destroyer Division 100 is specifically what I'm hunting for. But specifically 100 probably is the one he can actually get hold of, because it's potentially with Destroyer Division 38. With Task Force 38.4, but also potentially with Task Force 38.3. If he can get hold of it, that's good, because that gives him 4 Fletchers. But also, if he's getting hold of 38.3 for 4 Fletchers, then he's probably getting Massachusetts and South Dakota. Which, if he calls his Rear Admiral, who's with them, and one of his Rear Admirals is with them, then he can honestly probably do it. Forward the document, say, look, we've got orders, we've been ordered to form up. We've received this message to form up. Let's go do it. In which case, he would have a force of 4 battleships, 2 heavy cruisers, 4 Bagley-class destroyers, which are, well, probably the heaviest hitting destroyers the US Navy has. The Bagley class carry 16 torpedoes each. 16 torpedoes each. This had also led to them having originally, as designed, a weak AA armament, but this has been rectified by 1943. And, they're useful. They're useful. And they can even do curve ahead fire, potentially, with their torpedo spread. But, it's something to have there. And add in some Fletchers, potentially, and you've got a very capable force. Not a lot of destroyers, but you've got a capable force. There's also something else he can potentially get his hands on. Okay? If he's coming in and he's messaging, if he messages Kincaid in any way, shape, or form and says, look, I'm short destroyers, is there anything I can borrow? There's potentially 9 extra Fletchers which can be sent to him. I don't think he would get the other destroyers sent to him. I don't see that as being an advantage or realistically useful for that particular operation. But if he can get the 9 Fletchers sent to him, that makes a difference. That makes a massive difference, because that means he now has 13 Fletchers, 4 Bagleys, no, 3 Bagleys. So he has 16. 16 destroyers. It's not a lot of destroyers, but it's enough. It is enough. 2 heavy cruisers and 4 battleships. That's not the overwhelming force which the Americans deploy to fight at Surrey Strait, but it's a very capable force. And if it's sitting in the San Bernardino Strait, and considering Lee's capabilities with radar, and the likelihood of that being a night attack, if we consider the timings of when dawn happened versus when the transit time of San Bernardino Strait would be, that could give him an advantage. That could give him an advantage. The question realistically is, could they make it? Could they make it to the San Bernardino Strait in time? Could they make it there in time? Yes. Especially if we consider the timeline for when the message went out. For when the message is sent. Because it's sent at roughly 3:15 on 24th of October. And that message had outlined a force, including the Iowas, of 4 battleships, 5 cruisers, and 14 destroyers. Including forces from what we're talking about. Under this scenario, whilst he doesn't have the Iowas, he does still have 4 battleships. He has 2 out of 5 cruisers. It would be nice to have more cruisers, but it's fine. And as long as he can get the 9 Fletchers off Kincaid, instead of having 14 destroyers, as he would have originally had, he can end up with somewhere approaching 16. So 16 destroyers, no Iowas, and 3 less cruisers. It's a different force. It's also not going to be as closely supported by the fast carrier groups, because they're still charging up north. And he is to an extent abandoning them to the attack on their own. But, saying that, there is some fleet carriers operating not far away. Consider that point there. If you have a fight starting off in the early hours of the morning, there, if I'm sort of level with it, in the San Bernardino Strait, then those carriers are going to react and start launching aircraft in your direction. There's going to be a general call for air support. And they're not also going to be dealing with being under gunfire at the same time. But to have a chance, you do need those 9 Fletchers. There is no scenario where that's good. And again, think about it from the Japanese perspective. Historically, Surigo Strait is here. This is where the massive ambush takes place. That's not far from where Samar happens. So realistically, it's all relatively easy to do. Relatively the same. The question then becomes, realistically, are the forces, and remember, Lee to get this is asking for 2 ships which were not supposed to be assigned to him, but they are under his command. They are part of his battle line assignment. They are part of his force structure. They are officers who report to him. So he can get them to come along, and if he can get them to come along, as said, he can get 4 extra destroyers as well as 2 extra battleships. That's a major component of force structure. That means he's not short in battleships and he's not short in destroyers. He needs those extra destroyers from Kincaid, but again, I think he could do it. Message Kincaid, maybe he doesn't get all of them, but any of them he gets is going to be useful. Any of them he gets is going to be important. Historically, Task Force 34 is created in the early hours of the morning and is then disbanded not long after it's found the Japanese have returned. They have gone back. It wasn't there. It wasn't there. But it could have been. And it could have made it. It could have made it. But what would they be up against? Now, the thing is, the next point is, if you do have such a force sitting in the San Bernardino Strait, what can it achieve? What's it going to be fighting? Well, 2 battleships, 2 battlecruisers, 6 8-inch cruisers, 2 6-inch cruisers, and 15 destroyers. That's quite a significant force, especially when you consider that's an 18-inch gun battleship, 16-inch gun battleship, 2 14-inch gun battlecruisers, and all the 8-inch cruisers, all the firepower they're bringing in, all the destroyers. That can look pretty scary, but, and I mean this with the nicest possible way, and nicest possible intention, there's a problem with this force structure. You see, if they're running into the Surigao Strait, they have a firepower advantage, or rather an equivalency on paper. You see, theoretically, in terms of weight of firepower, you are dealing with 36 16-inch guns on one side. You're dealing with 16 14-inch, 8 16-inch, and 9 18-inch guns on the other side. In weight of fire, theoretically they're the same. But in practice, 2 are modernized battlecruisers, which are going to get slammed hard by the 16-inch shells coming in from the American battle force. Nagato has not been modernized as much as she probably needs to be for this kind of fight. And the 18-inch guns on Yamato are not as long-ranged as you would think. Because one of the troubles that often comes up is we start talking about guns, we're talking about 15-inch 42s, 14-inch 45s, 16-inch 50s, right? But because of size and charge, the 18-inch 45s on Yamato, which look really powerful and really scary when you think about it, their effective firing range is 25 kilometers. Maximum firing range at 45 degrees angle elevation is 42 kilometers. The maximum firing range, and to an extent the effective firing range, of the 16-inch 50 is 38 kilometers. Why does the effective firing range of the 16-inch 50 differ so much to the effective firing range of the 18-inch 45 of the Japanese? It's down to the fire control systems they have. It really is. The Japanese fire control is good, don't get me wrong. They have got some of the best fire control systems in the world this time. But the American one is just that bit better. And the thing is, the American one also comes up with the fact that all their ships pretty much have it. They've all got the same level. They've all got a very good level of fire control. Whereas for the Japanese, not all their ships have the same level of fire control. Not all their ships have radar even at this point. And this is going to be a problem for them. This is going to be an issue in this fight. Because in this fight, the scenario I would say is the Japanese would come in and would find the Americans waiting for them, like at Surigao Strait. And the Americans would engage. And whilst the Americans won't have quite the compelling, overwhelming firepower advantage they have at Surigao Strait, in this scenario, being able to get the first shots in, if they do that, being able to engage first in a early morning, nighttime by conditions a scenario fight, I could see the Japanese getting hammered hard. And that's probably what happens to them. That is probably what happens to the Japanese. You see, their force on paper matches, but it only matches if it can maneuver. And if they're caught in a strait like at Surigao, they don't have the room to maneuver. The Americans are sitting one side of the strait firing into it. To get through to the Americans, you have to go through that strait. You can't do that because the Americans are blasting away in that strait. With enough destroyers, they can hold a skirmish line. they can keep the Japanese back beyond that. If we consider how well the American destroyers and Taffy 3 do to hold up and stop the Japanese getting to their escort carriers, imagine how well they'll do if they're being backed by cruisers and battleships. With the escort carriers still launching aircraft a little bit further away, but still close enough they're going to get into the fight and get some licks in. They'll just be probably formed up into decent air groups when they're doing the attack, rather than coming in dribs and drabs as they're launched. That's the reality. So that all being said, what are the likely results? Well, if it's a daylight battle, then the Japanese have far more chances. The Americans don't have air support if it's a nighttime battle, but the Americans have radar-guided gunnery and a lot of firepower. And let's be honest, if the Surigo Strait shows us anything, it's that if you have the right position and you have the enemy coming in, you can put a lot of shells downrange on them very quickly. And it would be the equivalent of crossing the enemy's T. It would be another Toshima. Odds are the Japanese lose probably, definitely to 2 battle cruisers, and possibly more than that. You know, when we're sort of talking about what's being lost, what's being damaged, I could see Nagato, and I could even see Yamato being lost. I could, but honestly, if it's a daytime battle, it's worse. If it's a daytime battle, then all those aircraft which historically get called up to try and defend their carriers and defend themselves could be called up to could be called in to strike. A daytime battle means, especially if you haven't got the 9 Fletchers from the 7th Fleet, you are at a bit of a disadvantage in a surface fight. The overwhelming Japanese destroyer numbers could cause some real damage to you, especially with their long-lance torpedoes, etc. But I really don't think it's likely to be a daytime fight. I really don't. Because if you consider when the actual times of engagement take place in the Battle of Samar, we're talking 0600 hours and afterwards. If we're talking about when they pass through the battle of the San Bernardino Strait, it's 0300 hours. It's 0300 hours. So it'd been 3 hours earlier. It means 3 hours before dawn, which means it's automatically going to be a nighttime fight. And the Japanese, if they run into such firepower, such resistance, they could well find themselves in trouble. Now, if for some reason they get delayed, if not only does Lee get in position but the Japanese get delayed, then it's a later on a fight. But realistically, that's unlikely. That's unlikely. Then the results of the battle. Well, honestly, Halsey has covered himself, and to an extent Lee's covered himself, because he could say, well, I received the first part of your message which said, we'll be formed, so I went and formed it. But I never received your second part of your message. That was sent by a different means of communication and wasn't picked up. That would be a very easy way to get over it, and then there's been a glorious battle, and so no one would want to look too dear. Both Halsey would save face, because Halsey would go, well, okay, you did this battle, you didn't have, you had an order you interpreted from me, I can see why you interpreted that way, Nimitz and King interpreted that way, Kincaid interpreted that way, everyone else interpreted that way, so yeah, it's, you didn't receive the follow-up message, so therefore you went and did it. And there's been a victory. And again, Halsey's not going to want to, after all, Halsey can say, well, that had been my plan. If I'd wanted it, that's what had happened. And they did, and there was a victory. It turned out the Japanese. So, therefore, my planning was correct. My contingency was implemented before I had implemented it myself, but it was done in time, and it was correct, and the Japanese were defeated. So, it all looks good from Halsey's perspective. It might annoy him. It will annoy him, but it'll survive. It'll survive. And realistically, things get okay from there, but the thing is, what do the Japanese do? If you have a battle where the Japanese lose as many ships at San Bernardino as they did at Surigo, then there's a problem. If the Japanese lose all their capital ships earlier on, they lose them in this big glorious battle at San Bernardino, A, Leyte gets a very different fourth battle. But B, and this is much more important, the Japanese lose enough capability earlier on, it might start changing some of the decisions they make later on. It certainly does change some of the battles, some of the possibilities for the future conflict, for the future of the conflict from then onwards. Remember, this all takes place in October 1944. October 1944. It will have a compounding effect on the war. A loss of such force, a loss of capability, they have not just lost their carrier arm, but they've now lost their capital ship arm. The Japanese Navy, in terms of major units, is out of the count now. No longer, doesn't really matter, doesn't really have the force there. That's going to have an effect on Allied planning. That's going to have an effect on Allied operations, on how they're approaching things. It's also going to affect on Japanese command decisions and what they think they're actually capable of. It's going to be no chance for a last ride of a capital ship if they're all gone. But ultimately, this is a very unlikely scenario to happen. Because for Lee to be there with enough forces, he has to get forces off Task Group 38.3, as well as Task Group 38, taking his own from 38.4. And he has to take orders out of context to an extent, get other units, take other units along with him, and get some forces off Kincaid as well. And so ultimately that's why it doesn't happen. Think about this. There is a legitimate force capable of being made. A legitimate force that could have done this operation. But if Lee did it, he's got no cover. If he turns up and the Japanese don't turn up, his career's over. If he's right, great. If he's wrong and the Japanese heavies go after the US Navy carriers, well, then there's real problems going to happen. So Lee's in a very difficult position. This is one of the reasons why I find it interesting when people talk about this scenario. Realistically, the only way you can do it is if Halsey actually activates his plan. And one of the problems you then have is whilst Lee should be in charge, Halsey's planning on going along with him. And Halsey is such a micromanager. Let's be honest, when we're talking about the order of battle of the task group TF-38, it's Vice Admiral Mark Mitcher, who is aboard the Lexington, who's theoretically in charge of Task Force 38. But even when he has queries brought to him, his answer is, if Halsey wanted his opinion, he'd ask for it. If not, he might as well go back to sleep. There's no point. Halsey's not a bad commander. But honestly, in this operation, when there are so many people saying, are you sure about leaving this straight unattended? Are you sure? And interpreting him as saying, you have to question, he made a mistake this time. Now, I have some fun recently, I have to admit, in that some people do seem to think that I'm permanently anti-government or anti-people in charge, and I find that strange, because often I've been one of the people in charge. The point I'll always make, and this is the point ultimately, I mentioned that before I get to this summary about Halsey, is he's human. Okay? We're all human. We can all make mistakes. We can all be stubborn. We can all get something wrong. And you cannot praise someone for the things they do right if you also do not critique them when they do something wrong. And you cannot really critique someone for what they do wrong if you don't praise them for the things they do right. You have to be fair to be able to give an honest evaluation of a person. And no one does everything wrong or everything right. And no government in its history has done everything wrong or everything right, because governments are made up of people. Okay? And you have to learn from when they do things right and when they do things wrong. So you do more things right and less things wrong, hopefully, as time goes on. Hopefully. And that's where alternate history comes in useful sometimes. To look at it and go, well, could this have worked? And the answer is, yes, it could. Would it have been better with the Iowas there? Yeah. Honestly, though, why the initial plan was going to leave two of their battleships out, I don't know. I really don't know with Halsey. It takes six battleships with you. 3 South Dakotas, a North Carolina, and 2 Iowas. That's a force which is annihilating center force. That is a force which is just going to go, oh, you turned up to play. How good. We're here. Because the sheer weight of fire on their side. The sheer weight of fire on their side. But it wasn't to be. It was not to be. And so that being said, I always finish these videos off with a question. And so the question is this. What do you think the long-term impact on the rest of the war would have been if Halsey had sent Lee? If Halsey hadn't included his flagship and said, right, now I'm staying with the rest of the Third Fleet. I'm sending you and all the ships which I outlined. And I think the problem comes the moment he decides that the Iowas have got to be part of the task group, because that means he's not going to deploy it. If the Iowas hadn't been part of the task group he decided to include, then he'd have done it, because he'd send Vice Admiral Lee off happily on his own. But the moment he's included his Iowas in it, that means he wants to be part of the fight. And he's only going to go if he's certain there's going to be a fight. And he's not. He thinks Kurita's withdrawing. He thinks the Japanese center force is withdrawing. So, why would he waste his own time? Why would he put his own fleet his own ships out of position? That's the mistake. I think the entirety of history changes if Halsey's staff do not include the Iowas in the task group 34 to be sent off. But that we'll leave to one side. What do you think happens to history if Halsey does send this force off? If Halsey does send the force under Lee to the San Bernardino Strait, and they do have a victory along the same lines as the Surigao Strait, what happens? With that being said, what do we have coming up? Well, when this video comes out, we're going to be well into September. Well into September. So, yeah, it's Collingwood and after Trafalgar coming up soon, I think, after this one. Anyway, thank you very much for watching. Hope you enjoyed, and take care. That being said...